Guys, I hope you're all well and that you were able to do yesterday's session and able to work through some of those tasks. It's got your brain back into a Christmas Carol mode. What I want us to do today is to go through the book a little bit more systematically, and we're going to look at how Dickens presents the character of Scrooge. Scrooge is the main character in this story. Everything is about him. So the whole purpose of the messages and ideas of this story, and Dickens's message of social change, and that true happiness and social harmony can only be found through kindness and generosity, is all conveyed through this character of Scrooge. So I think the best way to revise the story is to look at Scrooge's journey, how he moves towards redemption and becomes a better person, and how that then relates to bigger themes and ideas. So that's the idea of today. So I'm just going to talk you through some key lines from the text which are significant and help us to revise and remember Scrooge's development and journey. So from stage one, obviously, Dickens opens the novel by deliberately making Scrooge as unpleasant as possible. His message, in a nutshell, we could say, is if even this avaricious, this cruel-hearted man can become a better person, there's hope for everybody. Anybody can change. So he deliberately presents them in these quite extreme terms, and obviously we see quite a lot of cruelty. The line I've picked first of all is this simile, as solitary as an oyster. It's a really lovely, easy to memorise simile that captures so much about Scrooge. The fact that he's got a hard shell, that he keeps his treasure closed away from others. But obviously this word solitary is absolutely key. And it's an instant recognition that Scrooge is entirely alone in the world. And although Scrooge's behaviour causes misery for others, Dickens always wants us to remember that actually the most miserable character is Scrooge. Through his choices, through his rejection of family, he is lonely and isolated. So it's not only the poorer people who will benefit from him changing, but him himself. And then obviously this second simile, which I'm sure your teachers have spoken about a lot, as hard and sharp as flint. Obviously hard, he's hard-hearted. The word sharp makes us think of a weapon, something that causes pain. So Dickens is keen for us to understand that he's not just cruel, but he's causing human suffering due to his behaviour. And then most interestingly, perhaps, the choice of comparison here. He's compared to flint, a rock which is capable of creating a spark which leads to a fire. And of course, in this novel, fire imagery is really important. Dickens is constantly using it to represent human warmth and how kindness can be found through human warmth and happiness. So the fact that Scrooge is compared to flint, it's easy on a superficial level to think it just shows that he's really horrible. But actually, it also gives us that hint that perhaps there's something better. There's a spark of hope and goodness within him. And then the last line I've picked is this very famous line that Scrooge says to the charity collector. The charity collector asks him to donate money to the poor. Scrooge refuses and he says, if they want to die, they had better get on with it and decrease the surplus population. Dickens directly echoing the political values and beliefs of his age. Economic policy believed that there was not enough to go round. So if we try and sort of visualise this, just give me a second here. Okay, so I think we could visualise this concept of the surplus population, and I'll attempt to draw it out because, you may be missing me drawing on the board at school. So if we consider that we have X amount of resources, so if we say this circle, or this strange shape I've just drawn, represents the number of resources available, the amount of food that is available for everybody to eat, and that this circle represents the number of people. Obviously, the concept of a surplus population is that this circle is smaller than this one. Therefore, there simply isn't enough for everybody. So this chunk of people in this area I'm currently shading in black, there's not enough for them. So it's inevitable that those people are going to die because there's not enough to go round. And that was economic belief policy at the time, that there was inevitability that people would die because there just wasn't enough to go round. And obviously the people who would die were the people at the bottom of society, the poorest people. Now Dickens was very much opposed to this, because what Dickens believed was that actually the pool of resources available was plenty big enough to feed everybody. The issue was greed. A small number of people had much more than they needed, and they had excessive amounts, which meant that some people didn't have enough. So in Dickens's view, and the view presented through his literature, the cause of human suffering wasn't that there wasn't enough resources, it was that actually there was too much greed. So when Scrooge says these words, when he talks about decreasing the surplus population, it's not just by chance. Dickens is making a really clear point here about the world he knew, and the way that people were treated. Okay, so let's just move this back up here. So in Stave 2, then, we start to see Scrooge's journey to redemption. We start to see him understanding and changing. So in Stave 2, we go back in time with him. We go back to him as a child, and what we see is a lonely boy reading near a feeble fire. And obviously that word there is key, isn't it? Lonely. It elicits some sympathy. This heartless character we've already met, we now start to see in a bit more empathetic human terms. So we can go on a journey with him. The fact he's reading near a feeble fire is, of course, also significant. As we know, fires symbolise the power of human kindness in this novel. His fire was feeble, it was weak, it was small. So we can see that Scrooge himself was a victim of a lack of love and warmth in his childhood, which has perhaps influenced him as an adult. He then goes forward in time and we see him getting older. We see him when he was working as an apprentice for Fezziwig, and we can see that at that time he was a young man full of joy and happiness. Fezziwig represents the ideal employer, and Scrooge himself observes that he has the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. The happiness he gives is quite as great as if it cost a fortune. So Dickens is really clearly here suggesting to those who were rich and powerful, who employed others, that they have an awful lot of power and responsibility, because their choices about how they treat others can determine the quality of another human being's life. However, of course, as we see Scrooge age in Stave 2, we see the bitterness and the hardness sink in. And this line I've picked out, there is nothing on which it is so hard as poverty, helps us to understand that, rather ironically, Scrooge's greed and mistreatment of the poor is because he is afraid of poverty. His desire to be rich perhaps stems from the fact he's afraid of being poor, but in his desire to save himself from poverty, he's lost sight of the suffering he's inflicting on others. But of course, that is changed in Stave 3. So in Stave 3, he's forced to confront the realities of poverty. He wants to hide from it in his counting house with all his money and his cruelty, but the Ghost of Christmas Present comes along and forces him to confront that poverty he's so afraid of. Probably most powerfully through the Cratchit family and through Tiny Tim. So the section I've picked out here, it's quite a long section, is when Scrooge discovers that Tiny Tim is going to die. Unless something changes, Tiny Tim is doomed, because their family simply don't have enough money to give him the medical care he needs. No, no, said Scrooge. No, kind spirits, say he will be spared. And this is a big change, isn't it? He's already said in Stave 1 it's fine if people die, and now he's pleading for the salvation and the saving of Tiny Tim. And of course the ghost repeats back to him his own words, and it says Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words. Hung his head. We can clearly infer from that he's ashamed of himself, that actually he realises his mistake, that the poor are people too, that he cannot just turn his back on them. And then we've got this powerful line from the ghost. The ghost lectures Scrooge, but really he's lecturing the reader and lecturing people that just because they are rich and have money and power and influence doesn't mean they have the right to see themselves as superior to those who don't, that only God has that power. So the lecture is kind of almost like Dickens's mouthpiece to the reader. Stave 4, much darker. We go from that jolliness of Stave 3 to the darkness of Stave 4. And Dickens does this to symbolise that Scrooge's future is truly hopeless. If he continues on a path of greed, he has no hope. So we see Scrooge, what has happened after Scrooge's death. People don't care about him. All they care about is his money. And that's in stark contrast to Tiny Tim, who, even though he had no money and power, is mourned for. Scrooge is horrified by this, and is the final thing that spurs him to desperately want to change his own future. But this is a Christmas book, so it's joyous at the end. This isn't meant to be a dark, horrible book. It's meant to be a joyous message. So we see Scrooge redeemed. In Stave 5, he wakes up and he realises that it's still Christmas Day and he has the chance to be a better man. He's as light as a feather. The weight of greed has been lifted off of him. He's as merry as a schoolboy. He's been reborn into his youth. He's refound what it is to care, what it is to have joy in life. The fog has gone. He runs to the window and there's no fog. He can now see clearly. He's not blinded by greed and he can see what truly matters. And then we've got this lovely moment where he says he's going to send the turkey to Bob Cratchit's house. He wants them to have the biggest one possible so they can have a wonderful feast. It's the beginning of his desire to try and, save that family. And key thing here, he shan't know who sends it. Scrooge sends the turkey anonymously. Dickens believed that philanthropy, charity, should be done because it's the right thing to do, not to bring praise from others. So when Scrooge starts being kinder, he doesn't broadcast it to everyone because it's not about him. It's about being a good person because it's right. So I, love this book. Even just talking about it here, I feel so uplifted by these wonderful messages. They're not messages for Christmas, are they? They're messages for human nature generally. And I think at this time when we're living through a global pandemic, we see so many lovely acts of kindness happening. People reaching out to help others who are less fortunate. Messages that are still as relevant to our time as they were to Dickens in a sense. Okay, so what I'd like to do in terms of task, all of those lines and details are in the knowledge booklet. So you can obviously replay this clip as many times as you need until you remember, or pause it and listen to me again. Or you can read the knowledge booklet. And then I'd like you to complete these because but sentences. So I have started sentences and all you have to do is finish them with the words because but. And I'll do one for you to show what I mean. So the first sentence says, in Stave 1, Dickens introduces Scrooge as a bitter, avaricious and heartless man. And then there's the conjunction because, which leads me to explain why. And being able to explain why is essential to success in English. So the reason Dickens does this, the reason he sets him up as such a terrible representation of humanity, is because it's central to his message, isn't it? That if even someone so terrible can change, anyone can. So I can just say, because it is important to Dickens's wider message of hope and change. If even Scrooge can change, anyone can. So a simple explanation of why. Now, the other thing I want you guys to be good at is but moments or however moments. Being able to explain changes or something that's different to the initial half of the statement. So even though Dickens introduces Scrooge as a bitter and avaricious and heartless man, he does use the flint simile to hint that there is a spark of goodness within him. But Dickens does use the flint, and I'll put the word flint in quote marks because it's an actual word from the text, the flint simile, to hint that Scrooge does have a spark of goodness within him. So I don't want detailed analytical paragraphs